Welcome to Establish the Edge. I am your host, Mike Leone, here with Anthony Amico. This week, took a couple weeks off for the holidays. Back at it this week. Amico and I are going to talk kind of like general playoff fantasy football strategy, looking at some expected games, like where that's useful, where it's not useful. And, branching from there, we'll take a look at some futures betting for the NFL playoffs, odds to win the conference championship, win the Super Bowl. Some tips, some discussion there. We aren't professional bettors, so just keep that in mind. We're kind of having fun with it. Like, we think we're being a little bit sharp, but there's a chance we're absolutely not being sharp. Next week, I'll have more specific content around FFPC and NFFC playoff contest strategies. Those contests I like a lot. The FFPC, I'm going to go pretty hard at. NFC, I don't go as hard at, but they have this wild card game with multipliers that's like pretty complex and crazy, and my brain loves trying to solve that problem. And then once we get past that, I might go to an every other week schedule in the off season. If there's any particular content you want to see, definitely like hit us up on the YouTube comments on iTunes, or really just hit me up on Twitter at 2hats1mike. All that out of the way, Amico, it's almost playoff time. Thanks for joining me, man.
Thanks for having me on. Pumped. This is the best time. I feel like we still find ways to degen, but it's like the playoffs, you get to kind of ingest like every game, and I don't know. I feel like it's a good time.
Yeah, if we're starting off this show a touch distracted, it's because we're trying to bet props on Cooper Kupp. His line was released at 136.5 yards. I think exactly what he needed to break the record, or right around there on DraftKings. And we took that under, but then some places are betting plus money on the over. It's crazy. Week 18 is crazy. I'm trying to distract myself from doing projections. That's the main reason for this show this week, quite frankly, is it just, I can procrastinate trying to do week 18 projections and instead talk playoff fantasy football. But like with anything, Amico, you got to know the rules of whatever game you're playing. We've got underdog best ball, where if you're playing in the big tournaments, you advance by round. Justin Herzig and I talked about this on an Establish the Edge episode. I think it's the last one that I recorded. He's also got an article up on Establish the Run talking about their playoff contest. And like, that's a totally unique thing. There's other best ball that's just total points throughout all the rounds of the playoffs. So, one of those formats you want to stack super heavily, because that's the only way to win the big contest, is to have people at the end in the Super Bowl for the underdog, tournaments. But if you're playing best ball throughout the course of the playoffs, Amico, or if you're doing any just sort of draft where your points count equally for all the rounds, the stacking might become a little bit less important, and the combination of players matters a little bit more in terms of, you want some guys that have, really high chances of scoring well early in the playoff rounds, and then some guys that just have a chance to go deeper, and you're mixing and matching a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I feel like in the underdog stuff, like there's guys who are studs that fall like towards the end, because, well, right now it's like, will they even make the playoffs, or they might only play one game, but like one big game in these like all points matter type contests are huge. You don't necessarily need like the 8-point Rashad Perryman game in the Super Bowl or something to bank. Like, you actually would prefer the 20-point game from a guy that gets eliminated in round one. So definitely a lot more things to consider. It's like hard because I've done both. It's like really hard to like adjust your mindset in each format.
Yeah, and that's where we're going to have rankings next week on Establish the Run, and we'll have them kind of two ways, like a per game ranking for each player, and then we'll have another ranking that's like total expected fantasy points for the playoffs, which is based on expected amount of games played kind of times that per game number, where the per game number, like round one, we know the matchup, and it'll be pretty, at least for 12 of the 14 teams, their first game, we know exactly who they're playing. It'll be opponent adjusted. And then for the other, expected games, we kind of just do a baseline for the player. If you wanted to get like crazy nuanced, you probably could, just based on all the, postseason spreads, like what they would be, like figure out the odds of playing what opponent. I think that's like trying to be overly precise, and your time's better spent on more macro strategy and kind of trusting that baseline. But I think it's going to be kind of, people are going to be asking, when do I use the per game number and when do I use the expected games number? And again, I think it comes down to your format a lot. If you're playing in like a 12-team snake draft and it's just total points for the playoffs, that total number is probably going to matter a little bit more, kind of depending on how the starting lineup structure works, where you might be able to figure out lineups where you're guaranteed players, like a full starting roster for the first round, second round, and like good odds of getting guys in the third, fourth round. And, even if you don't make it to the Super Bowl, Amico, as you said, if you get guys that go off. So, but that the per game number, I think, matters more. And this is what Herzig was talking about in the Underdog Best Ball stream, was if you're in contests where like maybe you only take like one player per team, or they like encourage super heavy stacking, even though those kind of sound like opposite, like you're sort of really, Amico, like thinking of, how do I get like the best players on the team and then like assume in certain scenarios that they go far, or like just really understanding the gaps between, the points scored and the distribution of players on a team. Like if you're doing pick one player per team, you kind of really just have to understand those gaps, and then, the volatility of those gaps based on how many games they might play.
That's honestly like my favorite format. Like that's just so classic. Because you need to get the teams right, and you need to get like the player from the teams right. So it's a 2-layered approach, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, the scenario-based drafting is neat, and I'm going to bring up what I had last year for expected games and kind of just walk through how, we're calculating expected games. So maybe it gets a little bit nerdy. What I did last year, Miko, is I kind of combined the 538 odds with the DraftKings like conference title, like odds to go to the Super Bowl, which is the conference title. That's basically what I did last year, more or less, and to get the games. And the way you can do this, you can kind of back into it just by having, if you want to do it as simple as possible, if you have odds of the team to go to the Super Bowl, that's really easy. Like last year, the Bills were, had 29% odds of going to the Super Bowl, and they didn't have a bye. So, that's 29% chance they're going to score 4 games, or they're going to play 4 games, 0.29 times 4. The first game too, we have the spreads and the money lines for all the first games. So we know the exact odds that they're going to win or lose the first game. And I actually think the best way to think of it is like the odds that they lose in each round. So they were like 25% to lose round 1. So now you've got, just from those 2 numbers alone, you figured out, they got a 25% chance of playing 1 game. They got a 29% chance of playing 4 games. That's a total of 54%. Obviously their total probability is going to equal 100%. And then you can kind of back into the 2 games, 3 games, like pretty intuitively from there without even some heavy math. And what we saw last year, with only one team having a bye, there's generally a team from each side of the bracket that's got a really high expected amount of games. Last year, it was Buffalo and New Orleans on 2 sides of the bracket. This year, Amico, what's interesting, if we go to the odds, the Bills and the Chiefs, and we'll get into this when we bet the betting part a little bit more, actually have better odds to go to the Super Bowl than the Titans. So there's a lot of expected games between those 2 teams, assuming the Titans hold on to that number 1 seed, which I think they're like around 75% or so to do right now.
Yeah, I mean, they're 10.5 point favorites themselves. And then so obviously there's scenarios even where they lose, where they still get it. So it's, I mean, I kind of think that, I don't know. Do you want to talk about this right now, or do you want to talk about let's stick with the macro stuff, I guess. Like,
let's stick with it. We'll get it. We're going to get into our Titans take when we get in the bet.
Yeah, we'll stick to the macro stuff. Like, it is interesting because I think the one bye really changes so much, because the bye increases your odds so much of making it to the conference title game. But since there's only one, like you said, like kind of by rule, there has to be some other team that is playing 3 games automatically right off the bat. So that's really what we should be trying to figure out. Like, there's nothing wrong with taking players from the team with the bye, because we know that, even though they lose a game up front, they're more likely to make a conference championship. Like I should say, there's a really good chance that they give you 2 games,
Yeah.
So that's the same as taking a team that starts early and loses in round 2. So there's nothing wrong with taking a team that's in the bye. We know that they have a great chance just to make it to the Super Bowl. And then if you can nail that second team, like you're saying, if you're alternating between Bills and Chiefs in whatever format you're playing, like that's a great way to approach it. In the NFC, I think it's a little tougher just because I think the teams are a lot flatter, and that's what a lot of the numbers show here.
The Packers have clinched the bye already in the NFC. And the odds on DraftKings, they're, definitely the favorite to advance to the Super Bowl out of the NFC. So and we'll have the full expected games along with those projections on ETR, but you are going to see what's going to be interesting, Miko. You're going to see Buffalo and Kansas City with the most expected games, and their players are going to really flood rankings that are just based off expected games quite a bit, and for good reason. They're also high scoring teams too, so it's not like it's just based off expected games. And then it's going to get like Green Bay, I think, is going to be third, and then it's going to get like kind of flat, and it's going to be a little bit strange to see how that points out. Now, if you are playing like underdog best ball, the expected game stuff almost doesn't matter a little bit. You're like almost just trying to stack the best players on the best team as possible. So, which, I mean, it's like, no shit. Like, you want to stack the best players.
We've cracked the code, guys. We've cracked the code.
But when, I guess the point is though, like when Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce go, you're better off stacking the best players on Tampa Bay and hoping Tampa Bay pushes through, even though their expected games is less than Kansas City or Buffalo. You're better off doing that. And even like playing it later, like you're better off taking, looking at the odds, like you're better off hoping that the Bengals advance and getting the premium Burrow, Chase, T. Higgins stack. And if they go all the way, like you're going to win that scenario. It's like what do you win? When do you win? You have to maximize your chance of winning the game. And then that completely flips though, if you're in these formats where, some formats you're not drawing dead if you don't have the teams to the Super Bowl. You might have already clinched. So definitely keep that in mind. Chris asks, are you guys trying to avoid team stacks where the teams are likely to eliminate one another wildcard matchup? So I think, again, it kind of comes down to the format that you're playing. If you're doing FFPC style, I think you have to take a player on 12 of the 14 playoff teams. So there's 2 teams you're completely fading. Obviously, in that scenario, you're going to take some teams against each other. There's a chance, too, that you get, like last year, we had the Browns, Steelers, mega shootout, Amico, where if you took a player on each side of that game, you scored a ton of fantasy points in that matchup with the correlation of that game going nutty. And then you also got this, like you were guaranteed a second round from some of those players. So I think that's something that you don't want to handicap your entire lineup if you're doing like a 12-team draft, let's say, not one of like the specific contests. You don't want to handicap your lineup and be running dead, like all your teams get eliminated. But I also wouldn't overthink it if you're getting a really strong value and you're guaranteeing someone getting a second game. Like there's 2 sides to that coin.
Yeah, I mean, the playoff stuff is just, it's more format dependent than like any other type of fantasy that we play, I feel like, because the way you approach these things is so different. Like obviously in like an underdog format, you're not going to stack the 3-6 matchup or something, like that would be,
you're straight drawing dead,
like that, right? Like that would be silly to do. But in a format where you're going to score you want just total points, like a first round shootout counts the same for you as a third round shootout. Obviously, like if you get extra games out of those players, that matters too. But you want the big spots where they come. So I would say that I'm not really like, well, first of all, right now I think it's almost impossible to avoid these situations because we don't know who's playing who yet. Like the only thing that's really locked in is Packers at 1 in the NFC. Everything else really is up for grabs. I mean, you could say Tennessee. You could say like Tennessee and Kansas City are like pretty big favorites to be 1-2 in the AFC. But like it's very up in the air, I feel like, who's going to be playing who. And like, so from that perspective right now, like I'm not really thinking too much about the matchups. Like I'm thinking more about like separating myself out by conference and then trying to just pick the best players from there.
Yeah. And next week, I'll get into more specific playoff stuff, player takes, once we have the actual matchup set and we know what the full bracket is. If you are looking at things this week, I know Herzig's been tweeting about, get your Chargers now, and hope that they win this game against the Raiders. I believe if they win, they're in. Whoever wins that game, I think, is like automatically in the playoffs. The Raiders Chargers game. So the Chargers are a team that I think like could maybe make a run, and people hate uncertainty. So they're probably going to be really cheap, whatever format you're doing. If you are drafting this week, if you're drafting, listening to this after week 18, of course, make sure you tune in to the show on Wednesday again next week, and we'll get into some more player specific stuff. Let's take this expected games though, because expected games can be wrong, right? Amico, this is based off the market odds. Let's try and galaxy brain ourselves. Let's talk about betting on the NFL playoffs in general. And this is something I did a show with Davis Maddock a couple of years ago, and it was the year that the Ravens rolled through the regular season, just dominated everybody. The models loved them, had them as a massive, massive favorite. And this is one where Davis and I looked at it, and I'm probably remembering it a little rosier, our opinion, than it actually was, because I think we were pretty pro Ravens. But there was a question to be had as to what are the unknowns in models, and like where can the market be wrong? And in this case, at least some of this hindsight bias, but the Ravens ran so pure in the regular season, Amico, that we didn't really know how they would play from behind. And it just was a good chance that the regular season data was overrating them a little bit, just because they were so dominant and just everything broke right for them in the regular season. And that was the year they ended up losing the first round, I believe, or the second round, their first game, to the Tennessee Titans. And then the Chiefs, on the flip side, they didn't have as clean of a regular season, but they had we knew a little bit more about like Mahomes and their talent and some stuff that might not be factored into the models, that like maybe those teams should have been a little bit tighter. If I might be remembering this wrong too. I think this might have been the one where the Chiefs, this was still the old rules, and the Chiefs ended up getting the bye in the second bye in the first round.
Yeah, I think this is 2 years ago. Yeah.
But anyways, you want to talk a little bit about like what are you looking at as far as why a team might be mispriced, either by models or by the market that we're betting on?
Well, so I mean, there's really two things that I think we need to consider. Like in the betting market, obviously a big factor is just who people are betting on, right? I mean, the book's goal isn't really to get it right; it's to take on the least amount of liability. So they're going to move the numbers. Like that's why the Chiefs are a favorite, like even though they don't have a bye. That's why you're going to see some of these teams that are sexier like pushed up in the market ratings versus maybe what the models say. And then like from the models perspective, a lot of times what they're looking at is overall numbers over the course of the season. Like I think that there's a lot of things that can get interesting in terms of splits on small samples, where like the model is going to tell you, and I'll talk about Tennessee, like the model is going to tell you that Tennessee is like, I think that some of these models tell you that Tennessee is like the worst one seed in the last decade, but we know from what we've followed throughout the year that they've been extremely injured. They dealt with a bunch of COVID stuff. They had long stretches without AJ Brown, stretches without Julio. Obviously, they haven't had Derrick Henry since Halloween. Like there's a chance that this team, when they're all playing together, actually is really good. And that's something that the model isn't picking up.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, they were just on fire. And like some of the models, I think that were weighting stuff tail end of the season a little bit more, even liked them. I think that was the year they went into Kansas City and they couldn't pull off the upset, but they had a little bit of a lead there to start. And this year, the defense seems like it's been improved from last year when it was like an absolute joke. And as you mentioned, like the offense should come around. They're a good one. I also think the Bengals are interesting. Now, I think the market's capturing this. Models might not be, but just looking at their number in the market, it might be capturing this. But their pass right over expectation, something I tweeted about. the last 2 weeks was like the highest of their entire season, and they went nuts. And they have the personnel to be a pass heavy team. And everything tells us that if you have that type of personnel, or really even anywhere, even just a normal personnel, passing is better than running. Like you have a higher EPA per play passing than running, and it's not even close. You do that with Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, and Tyler Boyd, and that's infinitely more true. And you still got a good back in Mixon, but you don't need to play, so soft. So it does seem like they're making a shift towards that. They get to rest their players this week. They've locked in the first round home game, winning their division. So that's another situation where I could see, the market being off a little bit. I feel like on New England, it might be off a little bit the other way. This might be my bias, but like the Football Outsiders market just really, really likes New England. And
yeah, I don't buy it.
I'm not seeing it yet. The kind of like the way that they win, like I'm not so sure if that translates into the NFL playoffs, where they are going to go up against passing games that are much more aggressive than them, even though New England has been decently efficient. So that's one I'm worried about. But kind of just resetting this as far as betting futures in general. This is a shorter time frame than a lot of futures, but you and I love to bet futures. One, it's just fun. It's like fun. It's one way to get money on a long shot and like feel like your money's in good. But the other thing is, Amico, the playoffs, maybe not the best example of this particular point. In general, though, futures markets are softer than other markets. Like they're more likely to be mispriced. There's not as much action on them. There's, the lines are just more likely to be off. And if you look at different books, you can kind of see where you can almost get to the point where it's rake free if you have access to multiple books and taking the best book. So I kind of put together, based on the conference championship odds, what the hold is for each book, between DraftKings, FanDuel, BetMGM, Caesars, and then like if you took just the best odds of those and the hold, like, so if we're doing conference champion, each conference should add up to 100%, implied probability. If there is no hold, only one team can win the conference championship. So pretty easy to see, like here on DraftKings, they add up to 114.5%. If you look at, the implied probability based on the money lines there. For example, the Bills are plus 300. That's an implied probability of 25%. That's their rake, is by making these add up to 115% instead of 100%. And, most of the books are right around this 111 to 114% marker. Right now, the AFC looks a little bit more juiced. I think that's part of that's because they still have some of these live teams that are really dead, that it's just kind of throwing away money on like Pittsburgh and Baltimore, for example, who are like super mega low to even make the playoffs. But if you look at the best odds, Amico, we can get that hold down from like 10 to 14% to like 5 to 7%. So we're cutting that down pretty good.
Yeah, and then you take out a couple of the teams, like take out a team that you just don't think is going to do anything, like Philly or something like that. Like you save yourself a little bit there, and all of a sudden we're betting 8 teams, and we're
Jalen Hurts, buddy. No. Now I'm gonna throw some teams at you that I think like that seem like they have like the biggest variation in odds. One of them, like Tampa Bay, interestingly, is anywhere from plus 320 on BetMGM to plus 450 on DraftKings. So that's one that has a little bit of a bigger spread. And the implied probability change, like that's 23.8% to 18.2%, almost a 6% probability spread. Like that's a pretty big difference between the two sites and the implied probability on their odds. I think they are the biggest one. But the Colts have, a similar spot where they're plus 800 on DraftKings, which is the worst spot to get them. But you go over to Caesars and they're plus 1,000. That change in probability is only like 2%, but you're getting, that's kind of a little bit magnitudes higher when you're talking about a low probability swing to begin with. So you definitely want to make sure you do your shopping. Anything stick out to you on those two teams, or there's still plenty of room for them to be both avoids, even at the best and worst number, because again, the hold is like a little bit high.
Yeah, I mean, I'm starting to get worried about Tampa Bay with all these pass catchers that they have out. That's kind of my concern. Like no Godwin. It sounds. I assume no AB, even though they still haven't cut him. Like maybe Brady's trying to reconcile things or something. I don't know. But like if their second best receiver in the playoffs is Cyril Grayson, like I have a really hard time seeing them make like a real serious run. It's not like their defense has been outstanding. They've struggled against the pass all year. So I'm kind of worried about them. Like I would note though that I think it's important to note that like, you know, you're saying there's a 6% difference top to bottom. Like that's raw percent. Like it is still like effectively like a 25% difference. Like just
that's percentage points. Yeah,
like percent change. It's really big in that context. And I know that like when the number gets really small, those numbers can be inflated a little bit, but you know it's hard to find that kind of value. I think in a lot of other markets. And then what was the second team? The Colts.
The Colts, you know, and again, like the percentage change, as you said, like matters a little bit because it goes from plus 800 to plus 1,000, which is, you know, a 25% increase in the odds, even though the percentage points, you know, you're going from like 9% implied probability to 11%. I personally don't see a lot on the Colts, like one way or the other, but they were one of the other bigger spread teams.
That's to me, like they're a team where everyone's just going to say the quarterback stinks, so you can't bet them. Like I think you're probably getting a little bit of value on Indy to begin with, just from that perspective.
Well, the quarterback stinks, and they're just a bad bet, Amico.
Like the thing though is that like you don't have to have an elite quarterback to have elite production over a 4-game sample. Like,
yeah,
Carson Wentz could just play the best football. Like Flacco did this a few years ago. Like I guess maybe 10 years ago now. I have no idea. But like you can have a bad quarterback play really well, you know what I mean? And Wentz has done that in the past. So, you know, we know that they're going to lean on their run game and all that stuff, but they seem to at least play pretty optimally in terms of like the decision-making and stuff, which is good.
Right. And yeah, that's something I want to come back to on a couple other teams in a bit, but what we hinted at Tennessee. We got into why we think Tennessee is underrated, but I think you and I are both a little bit surprised that you can get them at plus 500 as the only team with a bye in the AFC to advance to the Super Bowl. That seems like a pretty strong bet. I think to actually win the Super Bowl, it's 12-1.
Yeah,
I'm not sure which is better, but Amico, like again, they're not guaranteed the bye, but they're like 80% to get the bye right now, and that I think people underestimate how important that is. Like they think about who's the best team. Like, oh, well, Kansas City and Buffalo are still better. And yeah, that might be true, but those teams have to win round one. And like the AFC isn't a slouch, like top to bottom, like all these teams are pretty dangerous. They could get eliminated. They could get injuries. They have less time to rest. So I don't think it's like a slam bet, but in a market that is a little more efficient than other futures markets, it is one that seems a little bit off.
And like the thing with Tennessee is like the bye, like there's no team in the league that gets more value out of this bye than them because they're injured. Like they're going to get Henry back. They're going to have a chance to make sure Julio's healthy, AJ Brown, make sure he's ready to go. Like they have some issues. They've had, you know, some guys in and out up front. Like this is a big deal for them to be able to get healthy, to get right. And the other thing too, is like, I keep hearing about how bad Tennessee is. Like they've beaten all these good teams in their schedule. They beat Kansas City. They beat Buffalo. I know that they got rolled by New England, but that was without all their receivers and without Henry. Like, I don't really know if I'm putting a ton of stock into that. Like, they've beaten good teams in the past. And I know, like, you know, sample size of one, like anyone can beat anyone, but it's just weird to me that I at least like from the people I've talked to, and I think the market too, like it seems like that stuff is just being completely thrown out.
Yeah. And something like, you know, they haven't really had their big trio together. Julio, what's Julio's injury status? I know Henry's supposed to be back. And AJ Brown is looking healthy. He had that massive game in his return from injury against San Francisco. But
Julio's limited today.
Julio, so he's looking pretty good to be able to play then. I'm assuming if he's limited today with a week off this week and another week off. But let's say there's a chance they get Julio. Like there's uncertainty is a good thing when it's not being baked in, right? Maybe their offense still isn't that good with Julio, Henry, and AJ Brown, you know, all healthy. but like maybe it's really good. Maybe it's one of the better offenses in the league. We don't know. And if you're going to give us the bye week and kind of we're almost free rolling that possibility, right? Like that they're better than we think, because the market's take on their talent is clearly being shown by the disrespect with the line based on the 1 week bye.
I mean, I might take them before the show's over. Like, you
better get it in. The teams I'm looking at in the NFC, man, I like Dallas, but I think they're priced right.
Yeah, it's always hard to find value on Dallas.
Yeah, and I do want to point out, we put in the Football Outsiders probabilities, like from their playoff odds page, and you can see like where the models must struggle, because like they're way off from the market, and clearly the market's not that off. But if you're curious, like where the ROI is from them, like they have New England as the highest ROI bet. If you can get them at plus 800, they have Dallas. They're really high on Dallas. They have them as the best bet in the NFC. And then Green Bay actually second there.
Coaching must not be weighted high enough in these models. I don't know.
But I like Arizona and San Francisco are somewhat intriguing to me. The San Francisco one's tough because they're not guaranteed to make the playoffs. They're 60% to make the playoffs. If they beat the Rams, they're in. If they lose to the Rams, and I'm doing this if you're watching on the 538 simulator, which is kind of cool. If they lose to the Rams, let's see, what do they need to happen if they lose?
Saints would have to lose. Saints have to lose. It's just it's the two of them for one spot. So it's either
two of them
Niners win or they lose and the Saints lose.
So it's So I don't know. And the Rams, I believe, are still
they're playing for the division. Yep.
No,
we are neck deep in this stuff, Leone. No, I've been grinding the scenario.
Oh no, Rams aren't clinched. Rams are clinched because I had them. No, I think the
Rams are clinched for a playoff spot, but not for the division.
Right. See, or Arizona can win the division. I forgot I had the anyways. But San Francisco, I don't know. What do you think about that? They're the type of team that I could see making a run. Like there's some uncertainty with Lance and Jimmy Garoppolo, what's going to happen at quarterback. But man, Kyle Shanahan's just able to squeeze so much efficiency out of the offense that they're pretty, I don't know, they're pretty intriguing to me. I do worry that they're get the requisite quarterback play to get there. I guess it's tough though with them, having a legitimate shot at missing the playoffs. Any San Francisco takes?
I don't know. I mean, I wish they'd just use Lance more. like the Lance start this weekend, I was like, why is this guy not why is the red zone package every week not Trey Lance? So, but I guess that's a different conversation. Like, I think that they're tricky because their defense really hasn't played that well, especially against the pass. And they have to beat like some teams with really good quarterbacks, Green Bay, Tampa,
right,
Dallas. It's really difficult, I think, to beat those teams with the defense that they have on a consistent basis. And they already have like better odds than Philly, who's already in, which I always think is really interesting. I do think it's likely that they're going to get that spot. I mean, I think it's
that's what's hard with them and the Chargers, where I can see those teams making runs, but it does seem to be baked into the market. The Chargers have like the same odds, and they're like 50-50 to make the playoffs, right? Like they have to beat the Raiders, and it's easy. I guess you could like Bayesian and kind of think in your head, like, oh, if they're good enough to win the Super Bowl, they'll beat the Raiders anyways. And like, if they lose to the Raiders, I wasn't going to win the bet anyways. And
I don't know. A road win or go home game, you never know.
Yeah, absolutely. And like shit happens in the playoffs. There's randomness. So there is a flaw in that logic too, where it's like them being in, even if, they were to win or lose this game, like, however you think that dictates their skill, like there's still just so much elements of randomness in an NFL game. One thing I did want to talk about is to look at the money line odds of a team you want to bet to win the Super Bowl, because there is a methodology, Amico, where let's say, okay, San Francisco gets in, and let's say they're like, I don't know, 14-1 to make the Super Bowl. So $100 bet wins me $1,400. I just want to bet it and get it over with. You could also do the rollover strategy though, where you take $100, you bet them money line week 1, you win, you take that full amount, but then money line week 2, and you roll it over. And sometimes you can actually end up with a much better kind of number in the end than if you took the futures bet, where instead of getting 14-1, you might end up like getting 20-1 on that bet, doing the rollover strategy. The hard part is there's a little bit of variance where like we don't know for sure what the lines are going to be, who they're going to play. And, some of them making the conference championship game or making the Super Bowl might be like there's upsets in other parts of the bracket, which help us. And then if we're doing the rollover strategy, all of a sudden, we thought they'd be plus 200, they're minus 200, and we're losing some EV. But that is something I've seen, some sharp people take advantage of. So just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, I'm too lazy for that. If I'm just keeping it a buck, like I'm not gonna.
There's a human element though too, of like screwing it up, right? Like of getting in your head and like,
oh yeah, should I take him again? Like I don't know, like.
So if it's good, yeah, exactly. And part of that you might say is like a feature, not a bug. Where like, oh, George Kittle got hurt, but they pulled off this upset. Now I don't have like I can just pull out, right? But I don't know. There's also an element of you might pull out just because you're getting scared, and like that's why you made the 14-1 bet in the first place. So, but I did want to point that out. We got to talk about my hometown Buffalo Bills before we get out of here. I'm a homer, but there are Bills. Amico, we got some great numbers on the Bills after they had lost to Tampa Bay, and I love betting on teams that like where you can see just such an extraordinary ceiling, but due to, again, the randomness of a single game, like they had lost to Tampa Bay, a really good team in Tampa Bay, on basically a bad non-call against Stephon Diggs, and they lose in overtime. The week before, they lose a 1-score game to New England, and it's the wind game. That's kind of like a garbage game. And overall on the season, I think at one point they were 1-5 in 1-score games. I'm not sure where it's settled yet, but those types of teams a lot of times are underrated by the market, and you want to look at them. Green Bay, this is back like when I was in college, but they had a year where I think they finished 10-6, but the entire season they were never trailing by more than a touchdown. And it was like, if you're thinking like that's probably a better indicator of how good this team is than the fact that they're 10-6. So the Bills now have a lot of steam, but the number still looks pretty good on them. Let's look at the Super Bowl number. We had the conference up, but to take down the whole thing, they're plus 750, third best Super Bowl odds, second in the AFC. Again, we think Tennessee's underrated. So what do we think? Do we think KC's a little bit overrated here if we like both Buffalo and Tennessee?
Yeah, probably. I mean, they don't have a bye, presumably, right? If they win and Tennessee loses, they will get it. But we're assuming they're going to have to play that extra game. And the AFC is just really good, like you said. Like even a 2-7 matchup where they play, the Chargers or whoever, like that's
if it's the Chargers.
Game,
like if you're looking at, let's say, so we've got Buffalo, Kansas City, Tennessee up top. If you've got the Colts, Bengals, Chargers, who am I missing there? Oh, New England. Like you don't really want to play anybody.
Yeah, the AFC is loaded. The AFC is loaded, and like that's why making these bets like so far in advance was so good, because like with the Buffalo
really
thing,
victory lapping our Bills closing line. That's
no. Because here's the thing though, is like you're just riding sentiment. Like they had just lost, like you said, but people were talking about like the Bills might miss the playoffs, and I'm like, the Bills still have to play Carolina, Atlanta, and the Jets. Like they are making the playoffs. Like, yeah, they're still rated as like one of the best teams in the league. Like where they are now is probably pretty appropriate. So just I think having that longer view. So yeah, I mean, I think just by virtue of the AFC being pretty deep, the Chiefs are probably overrated. And I think even like the Patriots are overrated. I know that the number isn't like super small on them, but rookie quarterback, they're going to have to play in some games where they're going to have to throw and score. Like, I think it's just really difficult. Like I think with the Patriots especially, people just assume like, oh well, they're just gonna outcoach the other team so well that it's not gonna matter. Like, no, they're just gonna give up 12 points and they'll win. Like that's how. But that doesn't really tend to work out that way in the playoffs.
Yeah, they play a lot of games that leaves the game in question, right?
Yeah.
Where maybe they're on the plus side of the coin flip, but it's still a weighted coin flip. Like that's how they play. And Bill B, obviously, still a really good strategic coach overall in terms of game planning, but he's one of the worst in the entire league in fourth down decision making at this point. Like you put, the Patriots up against like the Chargers, for example, like, with their aggressiveness, like I think that's a pretty close game, even though the Patriots should be favored, but like I'm with you. But the market's kind of like they have the Patriots more in line with the Colts and the Bengals. And but yeah, the Chargers are interesting to me because like the coaching edge, like they have one of the sharpest coaches in the league. What's funny, and I want to bring this up, in the NFC, like part of me wants to bet on Arizona. Part of me doesn't want to have anything to do with Cliff Kingsbury in the playoffs, but
he's been good. The thing with Cliff is that like ESPN had that piece on the fourth down decision making, and Cliff was like top 3. I think he might have been first. Like he does like one thing a game where you're like, what the heck are you doing? And like that's what people remember. But it seems like in the aggregate, he actually is making like mostly good decisions. And
you have to compare him to the other coaches like LaFleur.
Right.
McVay is one of the worst in the entire league at fourth down. Tampa Bay and Dallas are pretty good with fourth down stuff, but like McCarthy's not exactly known as, the sharpest of coaches, even though you get the fourth down stuff. So, it gets a little shaky there, like especially at the very top with Green Bay and the Rams being the 2 favorites. Like those teams in some ways have some shakiness, and we've seen the Rams offense multiple years kind of, tail off over the course of the season. We'll see. They did a little bit this year, but they've kind of like plateaued a bit here with Stafford in a good way, a plateau in a good way, where they haven't totally cratered off. We'll see what happens there in the playoffs. But
yeah, I'm pretty okay with Arizona. I mean, first of all, like they're still outs. It's a very, very long shot for them, but there's still outs actually that they could get like the 2 seed, like they could get 2 home field
win
games.
And a loss. They
could get minimum 1 home game if they win the division. They could get to the 2 if they get a little bit of help, and get a second home game. So there's definitely some things that probably aren't being priced in, and also like at some point they could get DeAndre Hopkins back. I think what they say conference championship game he could potentially play if they make it. Like that's probably not being priced in. So, and I think riding some of that sentiment stuff. They just beat Dallas, which helps a lot with that, but. Obviously, they were one of the coldest teams in the league after starting out really hot. Right. So I think odds wise, market wise, like they're probably a good bet in the NFC. The NFC to me is just like completely wide open for the exact opposite reasons as the AFC. Like the AFC, I'm like, oh man, like all these teams, like they're so good. The Chiefs, the Bills, the Chargers, I love them. And then the NFC, I'm like, oh man, like I don't want to bet. I don't want to bet on McCarthy. I don't want to bet on, and then it's like you can't bet Green Bay because they're so heavily favored.
Right. Like I feel like Green Bay is overjuiced, but I don't know. Like it's just spread out so evenly among the other teams that it's a little bit. I think I'm like my heart wants to bet Dallas, but I think the number where it is now is there's not much meat on that bone, and then it's like Arizona or San Francisco is a long shot. Arizona plus 1,000 is probably the move if you're going to do anything there. But all right, this has been fun. I hope to do like more future stuff throughout the year. Next year, it's been hard for me because New York doesn't have legal sports betting. So like
it's coming.
Just doesn't have my attention. Yeah, it's coming. So next year they should have it. So I'm pretty stoked for that. Although, Amico, I am mega tilting that I'm pretty sure they're not going to have draft props, even if they get the they have something in New York where you can't bet on opinions. Like you can only bet on factual like game outcomes.
Yeah.
Like you can't bet. So like I don't think you can bet on MVP, for example, in New York. So I'm pretty tilting that. I know, right? Like it's so it's just like fake morality. Like but anyways, hopefully we'll have more content on futures. Let us know if you liked the sports betting content. Of course, we're not professional bettors by any stretch of the imagination. We're just trying to have fun with it and seeing if we can find any sharp angles to take. So leave a thumbs up on YouTube, a review. Also do that if you're listening on the podcast on iTunes. It helps us a lot. Amico, thanks so much for joining me, man.
Of course, anytime.
All right, go Bills. Let's cash those futures tickets.